Over 6 million people travel to Colombia every single year, and these are the 9 things that as a traveler or a digital nomad, you must know about Colombia if you go there. Because if you don't know these 9 things, you're not only getting scammed, but you're also putting yourself at risk and probably paying much more money than you should be to be having a good time in Colombia. Now, how do I know these things? Well, I have spent over 15 months living in Colombia. I spent the summer there in 2022, 2023, 2024, and I spoke at a conference there in early 2025. And the first point I'm going to start on is actually a controversial one. I think if you're a male dating in Colombia, that is a terrible idea. Now, I know what people are thinking. They're thinking, Luke, you've lost your mind. The women in Colombia are some of the most beautiful women in the world. And I agree with that. I 100% agree with that. But if you go to Colombia looking for love or looking for your next wife, I think there is a lot of misconceptions about dating in Colombia as a male or as a gringo or as what many people are calling the passport bros. Now, it is true there is a lot of attractive women in Colombia. It is true that on average, women in Colombia, they're much more attractive than the average people in the rest of South America. Most people don't realize about dating in Colombia is you've got a lot of headwinds that you're battling with. Firstly, the typical Colombian man actually has a lot of game. Typically, they're in shape, they're tall, they're very different to most other males in South America. So you have a lot of competition from the locals, but you also have a lot of competition from the fellow tourists. Again, as we talked about in the introduction, over 6 million tourists travel to Colombia every single year. And amongst those 6 million tourists, you're battling with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, other very wealthy, very successful, very tall, very in shape males who go to Colombia purely for the materialistic dating experience in Colombia. So that's the first headwind you're facing. The second headwind you're facing is a little bit of a controversial or sticky topic for me to explore, but I just don't think there's a lot of wife material females in Colombia. Again, don't throw tomatoes at me when I go back to Colombia, but personally what I've found is the culture is very centered on promiscuity. The second big headwind that I think you're going to be faced with if you are looking for a serious relationship in Colombia is a difficult topic for me to explore, but let's just put it this way. Education is not necessarily at the heart of the culture in cities like Medellin, for example. Promiscuity and materialistic lifestyles is, let's say, at the center of culture in Medellin. So I've personally found it more difficult to find wife material girlfriends in a city like Medellin. Now, again, that's all I'm going to delve into in that topic. So we've got the supply and demand imbalance. That's the first headwind you're faced with if you're a guy. Yes, there's a ton of very gorgeous girls, but there's a ton of competition. And then I think the type of girl that you're going to find in Medellin might not quite be wife material. Yes, she could be gorgeous, she could be beautiful, but again, just personally something I observed. I'm just going to show you what I've found. And then obviously the third big danger, which is something that is slightly overblown, but that is the safety of dating in Medellin. Now, it's very well documented at this stage that scopolamine is a very prevalent drug in Colombia. What is that? It's essentially like a white powdered drug that girls will typically put in the drinks or literally blow it into the face of their date, and the date becomes completely submissive and will literally do anything that girl tells them to do. So you're essentially like a zombie. You're very out of your senses. You don't remember anything. You're not thinking consciously, but you're very compliant. So there are so many videos of females who will take their date to the local bank, and the male will literally empty their bank account. The male will literally punch in the PIN code for their credit card. And there are literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of stories of this happening in Colombia. So that is the third big headwind that you're faced with if you are trying to date in Colombia. Now let's move on to a more optimistic note for the second point. Let me share a tangible example that I personally use to kind of conceptualize this point that's really difficult to understand. So let's say that about 40% of the age-appropriate females are, let's say, attractive enough to date, so to say. Obviously, this is a large portion of the population. 40% of the girls are somewhat attractive, okay? That's a lot. So if you think there's a million girls, that means there's about 400,000 attractive enough girls who you might want to date. So again, very different to a country like Peru. Most people would agree that the average Colombian is more attractive than the average Peruvian. Let's say, on average, 20% of the age-appropriate females in Peru is actually someone who you would like to date. So if you have 1,000,000 Peruvians, let's say 200,000 are dateable. So a lot of people would say, okay, you got 400,000 Colombian women who you might want to date versus 200,000 Peruvian women who you might want to date. Colombia is the obvious pick, right? Wrong. So again, people completely forget about the supply and demand imbalance. Your chances of landing a 9 or a 9.5 or even a 10 in Colombia, I think, and I have found, is significantly lower than in somewhere like Peru, purely because there is no competition in Peru. Again, what did we say about the average male in Colombia? Tall, has game, has confidence, has cockiness. And then you also have all of the other thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of very successful, very wealthy, very good looking gringos who go to Colombia every year. How many tourists go to Lima in Peru, a city of 15 million people? Not many. And how many of the local population, the Peruvian male, are able to actually get the high class 8, 9s or even 9.5s or 10s in Peru? Not many. And this is why I've found, again, someone is a very average looking male, I've found so much more success dating in Peru as opposed to Colombia, purely based upon this supply and demand equation. Let's completely forget the type of girl that each country has as well. Because again, like we laid out, the culture in Medellin, very different, more based on materialism and promiscuity. In Lima, completely different story. In Lima is like the education capital of the world. The large majority of the girls who I ended up dating in Peru were educated, successful, and actually wanted to do something with their life. They spoke English, and that's because Lima is seen as the city as every single person in Peru wants to travel to. They want to go to Lima for a better job, for a better opportunity, or to study. Completely different to Medellin, Colombia. So that's the first kind of headwind. This is the supply and demand equation that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the past few years. Next big headwind. Now, don't get me wrong. We got lots of scary videos that get circulated in Western media trying to highlight the fact that Colombia is riddled with gang members. It's Pablo Escobar's former stomping ground. And if you go to Colombia, you're gonna get kidnapped. But that is absolutely not the case. Yes, Colombia, it's a country you do need to be at least aware of your surroundings, okay? If you're walking the streets at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday or a Sunday night, you're probably gonna get yourself in a little bit of a strife if you're not aware of your surroundings. But the perception of Western media is it's one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and it's simply not. Yes, there are dangerous countries in South America like Brazil, but countries like Colombia and Mexico, I think they're being unfairly treated. I'm gonna come back to this safety argument in point number 9 in a moment, but then I wanna talk about the next big point. But before we get there, I wanna talk a little bit more about the natural beauty of Colombia. Colombia is a very diverse country. You have little beach towns like Santa Marta and Barranquilla, and then you have the 2 big major capital cities that most people think about, and that's Bogota and Medellin. And both these cities are very different, but let's start talking about Medellin. So Medellin is known as the city of eternal spring, and that's because their climate is incredible year round, as we're about to explore, but it is also incredibly green. Medellin is this really beautiful tropical-like city. There's trees everywhere. It's perched up in the mountains. It's absolutely gorgeous. As you can see, all of the views from the rooftop balconies, the restaurants, they're absolutely incredible in Medellin. And it really does just feel different living in a city where there's trees all around you. The air is nicer, there's a lot of wind and ventilation. And again, you're only gonna notice these differences when you go and live in like a concrete prison cell city like Sao Paulo or even Lima, one of my favorite cities in the world that's just very different to Medellin when we start talking about the natural beauty. And of course, Medellin is home to many other world famous tourist attractions like Guadalupe. This is a little city about 3 hours away from Medellin, which I think is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my entire life. You guys know I hate traveling. I hate being sat down. I normally film all my videos standing up, walking around, because let's be honest, I've got a little bit of an old man back, and you do need to go on a 3-hour car ride to get to Guadalupe. But I've been there 3 times in the 12 or 13 months that I've spent living in Medellin over the past 4 years of my little traveling journey. So again, you've got Guadalupe, you've got the beaches, you've got Medellin. I personally am not a fan of Bogota purely because the climate is very different to Medellin. Medellin is known as the city of eternal spring because the weather really doesn't change. Sunshine and your temperature kind of ranges between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius all year round. It gets a little bit cooler at night, so it's very easy to sleep. And the city just has a beautiful climate. Bogota's a little bit different. It's always overcast, it's always cloudy. It's a little bit like Lima is in the winter months all the way down in Peru. But that's a little bit of a summary of the climate and the natural beauty that I found in Colombia. Now, let's be honest, most travelers want to know about the cost of living of a country. And it is true, Colombia is one of the most cheapest countries that I've personally lived in South America. Not only are the restaurants incredibly cheap, the apartments are incredibly cheap, as we're going to talk a little bit more about in point number 6. But most importantly, the restaurants are really cheap. So I had some friends visit me back in 2023 in Medellin, Colombia. There was 4 of us and they were in town for about a week. So I took them to each of my favorite restaurants in the city in Medellin. As you can see, beautiful views overseeing the entire city. We went to some of the most entertaining restaurants as well, and even going to some of the most interesting, beautiful restaurants in the city. Each night, the bill was like less than $300 to $400 for 4 people. And we'd get appetizers, a couple drinks, you know, mains, and even desserts. And it really is that cheap. One of my best friends, Josh, who I have lived with in Medellin, Colombia for multiple occasions, for multiple months in 2022 and 2023 and 2024, Josh and I lived together as well. And this point about cost of living kind of leads me into the next one somewhat seamlessly. Medellin has the best entertainment in the world. Like, as you can see, some of these restaurants are insane, the kind of live shows that you get. And we're talking about PG rated live shows, but we have, like, for example, in Tulum, there's a magician who goes around to each one of the tables and he's performing little magic tricks for a little, you know, 5 or 10 minute skit for each dinner. It's like a private little magic show. That's just kind of insane. And like, it's very difficult to find that kind of experience anywhere in the world, especially for the price that you pay in Colombia. Like, these dinners are cheap. Now let's quickly hit on food quality. We showed you guys that the restaurants is very vibrant. The entertainment scene in Medellin is second to none. And the food quality is pretty similar. Of all the countries I've traveled to, Colombia's food quality, it's right up there. Your local fruits, vegetables, incredible quality. You can get really nice meat, especially at all of the nice restaurants. I think the food quality in Colombia, it's great and it's cost effective. I think it's some of the best in South America. It's not quite at that European standard. Again, I think, like, this is the way I think about things, but on average, your food quality and your access to super high quality stuff in Europe, it's like a 9 or a 9.5 out of 10. And Colombia, it's like an 8.5. It's not that far behind, but again, you can get it a little bit cheaper in Colombia. So food quality is great. Another big thing that travelers want to know about is infrastructure. Is it developed, or am I going to a third world ghetto like many people think Colombia is? Now, Colombia is very developed, and not only is it very developed, but Colombia also has great Airbnbs at really great prices. You can save a ton of money living in Colombia. You can get a nice little 1-bedroom, you know, studio apartment, so to say, in a nice complex with a pool, gym, and even great views for maybe $1,000 a month. To compare that with, let's say, what you can get in Europe, to get an equivalent type of nice 1-bedroom apartment in a somewhat safe location with a pool and a gym, you might be paying $2,500 a month, if not a lot more. So again, very cost-effective apartments in Colombia. This is why so many people move to Colombia. It's incredibly cheap, and you do get great bang for your buck, especially when it comes to apartments and living. Now, another thing that maybe I'm a little bit more focused on than some other travelers is just the general sanity. So I'm probably more concerned about this because I'm someone like kind of looking to settle down right now. I'm not exactly the typical party animal digital nomad that some people are, and no shade against them. That's cool, that's great. But I'm looking to kind of settle down a little bit. I want a nice, quiet, retired-ish lifestyle. And I'm also a little bit more concerned about not getting locked inside my home country for 2 years like I was in Australia. I had no escape. Now, again, Colombia, it's interesting because it's a South American country. So if things kind of go sideways, you can just move to a neighboring country relatively easier than you could in Australia. So I'm always looking at what is the government regulations, the government policies. They have a left-leaning president who is, let's just say, following in the footsteps of other left-leaning leaders around the world, like Canada's president, Australia's prime minister, or the UK's prime minister, who I'm personally just not super excited to be surrounded with. I'll just leave that there. there. Now, the final point I wanted to talk about is the culture. Now, I left this to last for Colombia because it's really interesting culture in Colombia. Now, what I found as kind of like a blanket rule is South America and Central America is incredibly welcoming to tourists and locals. Again, it varies from country to country, and obviously let's leave Brazil out of this because there is a clear difference when we start talking about Portuguese culture. But what I found is Spanish culture in South America and Central America, incredibly welcoming, really friendly. They really want to help tourists. That's kind of your blanket rule. Now, Colombia is a little bit of an exception to this because there is this big go home gringo movement. And this makes a lot of sense because for over a decade now, let's just say Western gringos and tourists have been going to Medellin, Colombia to take advantage of the materialistic and promiscuity that has kind of been accepted as being the norm in cities like Medellin. Again, each city is very different. I'm more talking about Medellin for this video right now. So obviously this makes a lot of sense that most of the locals here, they see a gringo and they associate a gringo being in Medellin, Colombia for being there for not so wholesome reasons. So what I found is even if you're somebody who has good intentions, or even if you have a girlfriend or a wife or a baby mama and you're traveling in Colombia, just because you're white and a gringo, and especially if you have a crazy haircut like this, the locals just assume that you are just like the other 70 or 80% of the tourists or travelers who go to Medellin, Colombia for the wrong reasons. So again, big caveat there. That's something that I've noticed. Yes, I still think the locals in Colombia are more helpful than the locals in Brazil or all over Europe, for example. But I do think that there is that difference and that caveat there for the city of Medellin that people should be aware of. Obviously, your other countries that I think are the friendliest in South America and Central America, it kind of starts with El Salvador and Peru. I think they are so welcoming of any tourist, no matter what they look like or what they wear. It's incredible. Every time I go back to El Salvador or Peru, I just pinch myself. I'm like, wow, this is how nice people can be. This is how helpful people can be. So obviously they're kind of at the top, and then you have a lot of these other countries like, let's say, Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, that are kind of more in the norm, so to say, for South American, Central American countries. And with all that said, those are 9 things every single digital nomad has to know about Colombia. But what about Costa Rica? Everybody asked me, Luke, what do you think about Costa Rica? Now, I also went to Costa Rica earlier in the year, and I filmed a video breaking down what I learned from spending 3 weeks in Costa Rica. I'm going to put a link to that video somewhere around there. And if you want to go to Peru, I've also done the same video. I might put a link to that one somewhere around there.